Have you ever seen a superstar fall from glory so fast that even the headlines can't keep up? Welcome to HollyLeaks. And today we dive into the desperate final moves of Sean Diddy Combs, who has just launched an explosive new plea to be released from jail before his sentencing. And trust me, this isn't your ordinary jailhouse letter because Diddy isn't just arguing law, he's trying to rewrite. The entire story of his downfall, from claims that the charges against him are rooted in outdated moral standards to chilling descriptions of the violent and chaotic conditions at the Metropolitan Detention Center, Diddy is pulling every legal, emotional, and strategic card he has left in a last-ditch attempt to convince the judge that he doesn't belong behind bars. And if you thought his defense team would stick to boring, legal jargon, think again. Because they are painting a picture of a man not guilty of force or coercion, but simply living a lifestyle that society might not approve of, but certainly doesn't deserve a prison sentence for their calling it exceptional circumstances. And exceptional is exactly what this case is, because not only was Diddy acquitted of racketeering and sex trafficking by a jury of his peers, but what remains are two controversial convictions under the Mann Act charges that date back to a law created in 1910. Yes, you heard that right. 1910. And in his defense filing, Diddy's team points out that when the White Slave Traffic Act was passed, women in America couldn't even vote, and that the law itself is soaked in a history of racism and misogyny. They argue that in 2025, using such a statute to prosecute a consensual swinger's lifestyle is not only outdated but a grave injustice. In fact, his attorneys claim that no one in modern American history has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act for doing what Diddy did, arranging consensual adult interactions between his long-term girlfriends and other adult men, without profit, without violence, and without coercion. But let's go deeper, because the letter to Judge Aaron Subramanian isn't just about legal precedent. It's about painting a vivid human picture of Diddy's life and the lives of the women involved. His legal team outlines in stunning detail how Cassie Ventura and Jane both willingly participated in what they call freak-offs, threesomes, and swinger club visits. They say this was a lifestyle, not a criminal enterprise. They describe situations where Jane even initiated contact with adult performers, including porn stars and escorts, stating that she missed certain men and that they would see the same people over and over for years. The defense even pulls historical comparisons to show how far society has come in its view on sexuality and intimacy, stating that while the Mann Act might have made sense in the early 20th century, it is now a relic being misused to criminalize private lives in 2025. And while this angle alone might not be enough to win over the court, it's combined with a second and equally disturbing claim about the conditions Diddy faces at the MDC. The defense outlines what they call unbearable circumstances, citing other cases where the terrible state of the Metropolitan Detention Center itself was used to justify pre-sentencing release. They describe long lockdowns, delays in medical treatment, and a general environment of chaos and danger. They go as far as calling the situation in need of surgery, not just a Band-Aid solution due to ongoing violence and serious threats to inmate safety, and even more shockingly, they mention that Diddy has already been the target of potential harm inside that facility. They claim that the jail is crawling with law enforcement agencies at all times, that violence is common, and that it is not just unsafe, but possibly unconstitutional to keep a non-violent celebrity who has already served nearly a year in such a facility, while others involved in the same activities, his girlfriends, the escorts, the agents, and the so-called cowboys, walk free. But that's not all, because the defense also focuses on showing that Diddy is not a flight risk and not a danger to society. They remind the court that he turned himself in voluntarily. Last year, gave up his passport long before his arrest and has a stable home in Miami that he can live in under full supervision. They also bring up a key detail from the trial that was used against him, that he admitted to past violence toward Cassie and one incident with Jane in June 2024. And while they don't deny that happened, They argue that it was a provoked single instance and that there has been no violence from him in the last 7 years. In fact, they say the court can impose any condition and Diddy will obey, including electronic monitoring, home confinement, mental health treatment, and even private security. If needed, they offer a $50 million bond secured by his Miami mansion to prove just how serious they are about ensuring his compliance. And now we enter the most controversial part of the argument, the claim that the Department of Justice has never before prosecuted someone like Diddy under the Mann Act without a commercial motive. They reference numerous cases in the Southern District of New York where convictions only occurred when defendants were running full-scale prostitution businesses for profit, not private consensual encounters between adults. In fact, they quote the DOJ manual from 1953 and even its current version, stating that prosecution should not happen in non-commercial situations unless there is trafficking involved, and in Diddy's case, the jury found no such trafficking. They further claim that if the charges had not been coupled with the more serious accusations like racketeering and trafficking, the government never would have pursued this case at all. And yet here he sits in jail awaiting sentencing on 2 Mann Act violations, while everyone else in the same web walks free to live their lives, and just when you think that's the end, they throw in the ultimate irony that Diddy didn't even sleep with many of the escorts involved, that he simply facilitated the experience for his partners, and that somehow this makes him the only John in America sitting in jail under a law meant to stop forced prostitution. They call it unprecedented, unjust, and completely out of step with how the Mann Act is interpreted in cities like New York and Los Angeles, where even the prosecutors have moved away from punishing customers of consensual sex work. And if that still doesn't move the needle, they hammer home the emotional stakes his 7 children, including 4 minors growing up without a father, and his willingness to cooperate with any condition the court deems necessary, even the most restrictive. All of this paints a picture not just of a legal battle, but of a man clawing back from the edge of destruction with everything he has left in a system that may not be ready to let him go now, as we prepare for part 2 of this incredible legal showdown and wait to see what the judge ultimately decides. Remember, one thing, this is not just a courtroom drama. This is a full-blown war for reputation, freedom, and legacy, and you're watching it unfold right here on HollyLeaks as the legal storm surrounding Sean Diddy Combs intensifies. The battle for his temporary freedom now hinges on whether Judge Aaron Subramanian will be swayed by the mountain of arguments set forth in this newly filed motion. And while his legal team is desperately trying to cast him as a misunderstood man, unfairly punished for consensual adult behavior, the prosecution is expected to come down hard with a rebuttal, and that could be devastating. Because despite being acquitted of the most serious charges, Diddy is still convicted, and any suggestion that his actions were entirely harmless will face scrutiny from prosecutors who have previously accused him of manipulating witness access, abusing phone privileges, and potentially orchestrating outside influence while incarcerated, even though the defense tried to dismiss these as minor or isolated incidents. The government is likely to present them as evidence of ongoing manipulation and disrespect for the judicial process, and that alone could be enough to tip the scale against any pre-sentencing release. And then there's the issue of public perception, because let's not forget that this entire trial has taken place under the watchful eye of a public obsessed with celebrity scandal and downfall, and even though jurors did not find evidence of coercion or force, many people following this case believe there was more happening behind the scenes that the law simply couldn't reach, and that emotional context might also influence the judge's final decision on bail, particularly when victims like Jane and Cassie painted a picture, not of physical violence in every instance, but of a power dynamic that made consent questionable. Now, the defense insists that both women were not only willing participants but enthusiastic partners in Diddy's unconventional lifestyle, but the prosecution will likely argue that just because someone agrees to something doesn't mean it's not exploitation, especially when one person in the relationship controls the wealth, the power, the access, and the fame. And it's that imbalance that haunts this case even in acquittal. And then there's the political climate. where attitudes toward sex work and power abuse are more charged than ever. Judges are under pressure to make examples out of high-profile figures, especially in cases involving sex and power, and Diddy, despite his legal victories, is still facing that cultural firestorm, and if the judge believes, even for a second, that releasing him could lead to public backlash or, worse, more misconduct behind closed doors, it's unlikely that any amount of bail conditions will make a difference. And yet the defense presses on with their strongest card that the Mann Act charges simply do not rise to the level of continued detention, citing precedent after precedent, where defendants in nearly identical situations were allowed to remain free until sentencing. They argue that this case should be no different, and that singling out Diddy for jail time is itself an injustice, especially given the violent and volatile environment he's allegedly endured for nearly a year inside the MDC. They even go so far as to compare him to other released individuals convicted under the same statute, arguing that the government is treating him unfairly and inconsistently, and in a move clearly designed to put pressure on the judge. They mention that if anything happens to Diddy while in custody, the responsibility will fall squarely on the justice system for keeping him locked in a place that even federal judges have called dangerous, unlivable, and unconstitutional. They paint a picture of a man trying to change, reclaiming his life, entering counseling programs, and preparing to be a father again for the children who still need him. And they say he is willing to wear an ankle monitor, stay confined in his home, undergo therapy, and surrender any right to privacy, if it means reuniting with his family even briefly before his sentencing on October 3rd. But the prosecution might come back with its own disturbing facts, reminding the court that this is not simply about what Diddy did, but how he did it. And with whom? Because while the jury may not have found sex trafficking, the reality of money exchanging hands, drugs being present, and a long trail of broken relationships creates a very different moral narrative, one that could still influence the judge's view of Diddy as a danger or as someone undeserving of special treatment. And of course we can't forget that the judge already denied previous bail requests, citing the severity of the accusations and the alleged history of violence. And even though the jury didn't convict on those charges, the original concerns still loom large, especially if the court believes that this case was just the tip of the iceberg and not a one-time anomaly. And that's where it gets most complicated, because legally speaking, the court could release him, but discretion lies entirely with Judge Subramanian, and if he's unconvinced that Diddy's situation is truly exceptional, no amount of arguments, emotional appeals, or financial guarantees will open those cell doors, and that is what makes this moment so critical, not just for Diddy, but for how celebrity justice is viewed in America. Because if the court agrees to release him, it will be seen by some as accountability being bypassed through money and power. But if they deny the request, many will argue that this is an outdated law, unfairly applied to a man who didn't run a brothel, didn't make a profit, and didn't hurt anyone in the legal sense. And in that tug of war between legal reasoning and public opinion, between morality and legality, between punishment and rehabilitation, Sean Diddy Combs sits in a jail cell wondering if the life he once had will ever return. And while the countdown to his October sentencing continues, the only certainty is that every move from now on will be analyzed, debated, and broadcast, because this is no longer just a criminal case, it's a cultural flashpoint, and you're watching it unfold in real time right here on HollyLeaks. So if you want the latest updates on Diddy's fate and all the most controversial trials from Hollywood to Washington, then make sure to like and subscribe to HollyLeaks, because the truth never stays buried for long.